If a maid on the 1st of May goes out to the woods on the break of day and washes in dew from the hawthorn tree, she will forever handsome be. Hi, I'm Lou, and this is Lily Rowe. Happy Beltane, or May Day. The trees are in full blossom, the bluebells are starting to come out and dangle their little merry chimes. Everything's at full peak of energy and fertility, everything's flowing. So to celebrate the season, we thought we would share a story with you, which is a traditional story. It was a ballad, a Scottish ballad, and I've found this story in a lovely book called The Children's Forest that I'll put the link in the description below for you. So grab a cuppa and get comfy, ready for story time. Gather good and close, my friends, gather around the fire, for who knows how this tale will end, who knows what will transpire. Long, long ago, in the hilly lands of the north, there lived a beautiful young lady named Janet. And Janet lived in her father's castle, and they owned all the land as far as they could see. One beautiful spring morning, when the sun was shining and the flowers were blooming, Janet felt the urge to go out and explore. So she braided up her golden hair and she hitched up her skirt and she ran out the castle barefoot through the meadow and out across the land. She came up to the very edge of the forest where she stopped because her father had told her that the forest was dangerous, that she was not to go into the forest because on All Hallows Eve the fairy folk would all come out and they would get up to lots of mischief. So she looked into the forest and she thought, well, it's not All Hallows Eve at the moment, it's the 1st of May. So it looked all enticing in there. The bluebells were waving, the trees, fresh leaves on the tree were kind of waving her in, the birds were singing a merry tune, and she felt like she wanted to explore. So she cautiously stepped across the brambles and the briar roses that were round the edge of the forest because nobody had been in there for so long, and she started to wander. She followed the deer paths through the woods and she hummed herself a merry tune. Eventually she found herself in the heart of the forest, and there stood a lone hawthorn tree in full Maytime bloom. Beautiful white blossoms were bedecked across its branches, and underneath this hawthorn tree there was a well, and this well was covered with wild roses growing and clambering around it. It was such a beautiful sight that Janet stopped to rest a while, and she picked one of these beautiful roses that was blush of pink, and she put it into one of her braids of her hair. She then took a moment to gaze down at the well water deep down in the earth. She was kind of lost in her own merry thoughts for a minute when suddenly a shadow was cast across the water. It took her by surprise and she looked up with a start. There beside her suddenly was a great milk-white horse, and as she looked up she could see its rider was a handsome young man, probably about the same age as she was. But as she looked at him, there was something odd about him. As she looked at his storm grey eyes, she thought, he doesn't look quite human. Maybe he's an elven knight or something. And he called down to her, "How dare you come into the forest without my say-so? And how dare you pick one of the Queen's roses? They belong to the Fairy Queen." Now Janet felt her stomach clench with a little bit of fear, but also she felt her feathers ruffle with a little bit of anger, because she didn't like being told what to do. She wasn't used to that. And so she smiled back at him and said, "I have just as much right to be in the forest here as you do, and the roses, they don't belong to anybody. They are free spirits." And with that, she plucked another rose from the well and she offered it to him, smiling. Now, this confused the young man quite a lot. He was obviously not used to being spoken to thus. And a smile crept across his lips too. And he had to climb off his great horse to take the rose from Janet. He smelt it cautiously and looked at her. She grinned at him. In the distance, she could hear a skylark singing in the meadow. "What's your name, boy?" she asked. "Tam Lin," he said. "Well, Tam Lin, the lark is singing in the meadow. Let's go and listen to it." And with that, she skipped off back towards the meadow. Tam Lin followed curiously. He wasn't sure quite what to make of this young lady. So he got to the edge of the forest, and where he could see her dancing in the sunshine. But he stopped at the edge of the forest and didn't take another step. "What's the matter?" called Janet. "It's lovely in the sunshine." "I can't go any further," said Tamlin. She's like, "What do you mean you can't go any further? There's plenty of room out here to dance and sing." "I cannot," said Tamlin, and he looked a bit sad, "for I fell asleep under a hawthorn tree. I didn't know it was the fairies' tree, and when I woke, there she was, the Fairy Queen, looking over me as I slept. And then I was cast into her spell. Now I'm bound to her. I'm bound to this place. I cannot leave the forest." And Janet understood, so she danced her way back towards the forest and back towards Tamlin. And they spent the rest of the day together, and then the next day, and then the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, and so on and so forth. And I cannot tell what they got up to in the forest. No, I can't, Bubs. And I cannot tell you what they got up to in the forest, for the green leaves were surrounding them. And I cannot say what they got up to in that forest because the beautiful wild roses surrounded them. But when they eventually came out and Janet left the greenwood, she left the greenwood with a child in her belly. The wheel of the year turned, and eventually the white blossoms of the May tree faded through all of the different colours of summer, and the golden oranges of autumn were upon them. And as the year darkened, Tamlin also began to become more withdrawn and a little bit saddened. "What's the matter?" asked Janet one day. And Tamlin explained that soon it was to be All Hallows Eve, and on that night the fairy folk parade through the woodland, and the Fairy Queen makes a sacrifice of one of her knights down to the netherworld. And this year he was the chosen one. Yes, Bubba, it was very sad. He was the chosen one to be the sacrifice. "Oh," exclaimed Janet, "but we must be able to do something to save you." "Yes, Bubs, we need to save him." "There is a way," said Tamlin, and he hung his head a little, looking worried. "But it's very dangerous, far too dangerous for a mortal to try. I can't ask you to do it." And Janet smiled and grinned at him. "Ask," she said. Soon enough, it was All Hallows Eve, and Janet snuck out of the castle and dashed across the dark meadow, through the swirling winds and driving rain. She reached the forest edge. Now that forest that once upon a time looked so inviting in spring with all the blossoms and flowers and sunshine, now looked rather dark and foreboding. She drew her cloak up tighter around her neck. She was wearing a lovely woolen cloak that was dyed the colour of fresh young hawthorn leaves. She stepped into the forest and followed the dark path down, down, down till she reached the heart of the forest. There she knew what to do, for Tamlin had explained very carefully what she needed to do. That great lone hawthorn tree that stood there, she took a moment to carefully crouch down and hide behind it, where the four paths met at a crossroads. Met at a crossroads. We were at a crossroads. Which way do we go? And she waited patiently in her hiding spot. Eventually, after what seemed like an age, she heard the church bells at a distance striking 12 midnight. On that final stroke, she heard a sound, thundering hooves and tinkling bells, and suddenly this great black horse walked past. It was bridled in silver and shod in gold, and it was snorting and stamping its way past. But she knew that she had to stay hidden. She didn't come out yet. She stayed in her hiding spot. Further stamping coming. This time a great chestnut brown horse came snorting past. And again, she did not move. She stayed in her hiding spot. Then she could hear something just on the edge of her human hearing. It was something she'd never heard before. It was more like a feeling. It was like a tingling. And there it was, the great milk-white horse coming past. And upon it was the fairy queen, Queen Mab. And behind her, sitting on the back of the horse, was her love. There was Tam Lin with his storm grey eyes looking pale in the moonlight. Now she knew what to do because she'd listened very carefully, and she sprung out of her hiding place and she grabbed Tamlin's shirt and she pulled with all her might so that he toppled down from the horse to the earth, and she wrapped him in her arms and held on to him tightly. Her belly started to tense with fear as she heard all the shrieking of the fairy folk all around her. And the queen of the fairies slowly turned her head to look at her and started to laugh. Tamlin belongs to me. Let him go, said the fairy queen. But Janet would not release her love. She had him in her arms and she shook her head vigorously. The fairy queen continued to laugh and raised one of her hands with a slight wave, and suddenly the fairy queen stared at Janet, raised one of her hands, and with a gentle wave gestured towards her. Tamlin started to wiggle and move and shrink. Suddenly there wasn't a man in Janet's arms at all. In fact, it was a slithering, wriggling snake, hissing and spitting. But Janet did not let go. She held on to her love. "Let him go," cried Queen Mab, and she took her other hand and gestured. Again, the snake started to pulsate, started to get bigger and hairier, and with big teeth and a snout was a bear. But Janet held on to her love, even with his hot breath and snarling teeth close to her face. The Queen of the Fairies was getting a little bit annoyed at this now. She narrowed her eyes and she stared at Janet really fiercely and shouted, "Let him go!" And she raised both of her hands this time, and lightning struck, and fur burst into flames. Where there was a bear, now there was a bar, a red hot flaming bar of iron. And Janet still held on to him. She would not let go of her love, and she knew exactly what to do because Tamlin had told her. She staggered slowly over to the well and she lowered her hands down into it. There was hissing and steaming as the flaming bar dissolved. And then out from the well stepped Tamlin, naked as the day he was born, and she undid her cloak and she wrapped him in her lovely green woolen cloak. Sighed the Queen of the Fairies, for she knew then that her spell had been broken. "Love, I should have turned your heart to stone," she said. And with that, she tossed her hair and G'd on her horse, and they were gone, followed by all of their fairy folk. 1,000 thundering hooves went off and faded into the distance. Just then, the first light of dawn was starting to cast itself across the land, and Janet and Tamlin took each other by the hand, and they walked out of the forest, home together forever. Do you have a favourite story or way of celebrating this time of year? Let me know in the comment section below. If you've enjoyed this video, do hit the like button and consider subscribing to our channel so you can join us in the woods again next time. And thanks for watching. Beltane energies fill the air. Passion and fertility are here to bear. Hawthorn blooms are sweet to see. Go gathering a May and head to the trees.